My name is Avery Park. The 2 seats in the front row stayed empty long after everyone else had taken theirs. An usher glanced at them, then looked back at me. Are these still reserved for your parents? For a second, I couldn't speak. Then I forced a smile. Not anymore. He nodded politely and walked away, leaving the 2 white name cards exactly where they were, reserved for family. The words blurred as tears threatened to spill. Around me, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents hugged their children. Grandparents proudly adjusted graduation caps for photos. Younger siblings waved homemade signs covered in glitter. Everywhere I looked, someone had shown up for someone they loved, except for me. My phone vibrated. I already knew who it was before I looked. Mom? Send pictures later. Have fun. That was all. No apology. No explanation. No, we're sorry we couldn't make it. Just 4 casual words. They somehow hurt more than silence, because they proved she didn't understand what she'd missed. Or maybe she understood perfectly. She just didn't think it mattered. 2 days earlier, I'd stood in my parents' kitchen holding my graduation invitation. Are you sure you can't come? I'd asked quietly. My mother barely looked up from packing winter clothes into a suitcase. Evan already booked the ski resort. We'd lose the deposit. I stared at her. My white coat ceremony only happens once. She zipped the suitcase shut. So does his vacation. My father didn't even join the conversation. He simply carried another bag to the car. That was his answer. My older brother, Evan, had always been the center of our family's universe. When he won a junior skiing championship, my parents drove through a blizzard just to watch him compete. When I won a statewide science competition, Mom mailed me a congratulation card 3 days later because she'd been busy. When Evan decided he wanted expensive ski equipment, they somehow found the money. When I needed help buying medical textbooks, I picked up extra shifts at the campus library. Growing up, I told myself it wasn't favoritism. It just looked that way by the time I reached medical school. I had stopped lying to myself. A warm voice interrupted my thoughts. Avery. I turned to see Dr. Nathan Collins, the physician who had mentored me since my first clinical rotation. He immediately noticed the empty seats. His eyes softened. They didn't come. It wasn't a question. I shook my head. They had another commitment. He didn't ask what it was. Maybe because he already knew. Or maybe because he understood that some wounds don't need to be reopened to be seen. Without saying another word, he walked toward an elderly couple standing near the aisle, his parents. They smiled as soon as they saw him. Nathan spoke quietly. Then all 3 looked toward me. A moment later, they walked over. Mrs. Collins reached for my hand before saying anything. My son tells us you've worked harder than almost anyone he's ever trained. I smiled awkwardly. That's very kind. She squeezed my hand. No one should celebrate a day like this alone. I immediately shook my head. Oh, I couldn't possibly ask. You didn't, Mr. Collins interrupted with a grin. We're volunteering. We'd be honored. For the first time that morning, the tightness in my chest eased. Not completely, but enough that I could finally take a full breath. As they settled into the 2 empty seats, I noticed one of the event coordinators watching us from across the auditorium. She checked something on a clipboard, then quietly spoke into the microphone clipped to her collar. A few moments later, another staff member approached. She smiled politely. Just confirming, these 2 guests will remain seated with Dr. Avery Park throughout the ceremony? Dr. Collins frowned. Yes. Is there a problem? The coordinator smiled again. Not at all. She checked another box on her clipboard and walked away without another word. I watched her disappear behind the stage curtains. Something about that exchange felt odd, as though someone backstage suddenly cared very much about who was sitting beside me. I had no idea why. But before the ceremony was over, I was going to find out. Backstage, the excitement was contagious. Graduates laughed nervously as they adjusted their white coats one last time. Phones flashed. Parents peeked through the curtains, waving whenever they spotted their children. My classmate Sophia nudged me with a smile. My grandparents drove 7 hours to be here. Seriously? I laughed. They wouldn't have missed this for anything. She pointed toward the audience. My little brother even made a banner. I looked where she was pointing. Bright blue poster board. Glitter. A giant drawing of a stethoscope. I smiled. It looks amazing. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. What about your family? I thought you said your parents were coming. For a moment, I considered lying. Instead, I said quietly, "They had other plans." Sophia's smile faded. "I'm sorry." Before either of us could continue, another student called everyone together for a group photo. I silently thanked them for the interruption. As we waited to line up, memories began surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. When Evan won his first regional skiing competition, my parents rented a cabin for the entire weekend just so they could cheer him on. When I presented my undergraduate research project at a statewide conference, my father texted, "Good luck. Tell us how it goes later." He never asked again. During my second year of medical school, I received an award for academic excellence. Only 10 students in the entire class were selected. I mailed my parents the invitation myself. My mother called the night before. "We're exhausted. We'll celebrate another time." Another time never happened. The certificate was still sitting in a drawer at home. Still wrapped in the envelope I'd carried it back in. This ceremony had been different. I'd invited them 6 months ago. They promised they'd be there. Dad even joked about embarrassing me with too many pictures. Then 3 weeks ago, Evan suggested a luxury ski vacation. Suddenly, everything changed. Flights became too expensive. Hotels were unreasonable. Travel was complicated. Then Evan posted photos of brand new skis that cost more than my semester's rent. That was when I stopped believing the excuses. Money had never been the issue. Priority was, and I had never been one. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Collins stepped into the preparation room carrying a small gift bag. "I hope you don't mind." She handed it to me. Inside was a delicate silver pen engraved with one sentence. "Every patient deserves your best." I looked up. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she smiled. "We're simply proud of you." No one outside my professors had ever said those words to me before. Not once. Before I could answer, another event coordinator hurried inside carrying a professional camera. "Dr. Park, may I take a few photos with your guests?" "My guests?" She smiled toward Mr. and Mrs. Collins. "Yes, of course," I replied. I assumed they were gathering photos for the university website. The photographer positioned us together. Perfect. Everyone smiled. Several pictures later, she thanked us and rushed away without another explanation. Minutes passed. Then another coordinator entered. She wore a headset and carried the same clipboard I'd noticed earlier. She looked directly at the Collinses. "I just need to confirm one last time. You'll both remain seated in the front row until the ceremony concludes?" Mr. Collins chuckled. "I promise we're not planning to escape." She laughed politely. "Wonderful. Again." She checked another box. "Again." She disappeared without explaining why. I watched the door close behind her. Something unusual was happening. I could feel it. But whatever the organizers were preparing, no one was willing to tell me. A few minutes later, the orchestra began playing. The ceremony was starting, and I was about to discover why everyone seemed so interested in who was sitting beside me. The music echoed through the auditorium as we walked onto the stage one row at a time. Hundreds of people stood and applauded. Some parents waved homemade signs. Others held up phones, determined to capture every second. I searched the front row. Mr. and Mrs. Collins immediately spotted me. They both stood. Mrs. Collins placed her hands around her mouth and called out, "That's our doctor!" Several people nearby laughed and applauded even louder. I couldn't help smiling. For the first time that morning, I didn't feel completely alone. One by one, my classmates crossed the stage. Each name was followed by cheers. Some families whistled. Some cried openly. One little girl jumped up and down every time her older sister appeared on the giant screen. The entire room felt filled with love. I wondered what that felt like. To know without question, someone would always show up for you. Then I heard my name, Avery Park. For a split second, everything else disappeared. I walked across the stage, accepted my white coat, shook hands with the dean. The applause seemed louder than I expected. When I looked toward the audience, the Collins family was standing again, clapping harder than anyone else. Dr. Collins gave me a proud nod. It wasn't the approval I'd spent my entire life chasing. Somehow, it meant more. The ceremony continued. I assumed we were almost finished. Then instead of closing the program, the master of ceremonies stepped back to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude today's white coat ceremony, we have one final presentation." The room immediately quieted. Students exchanged confused looks. I frowned. This wasn't listed in the program. The host smiled. Each year, physicians, Hospitals, faculty members, and community organizations across the country nominate graduating medical students who have demonstrated extraordinary commitment to serving underserved communities. Whispers spread across the auditorium. I didn't know there was another award. Neither did I. I glanced at Dr. Collins. He kept his expression perfectly calm. Too calm, almost as if he already knew what was coming. The host continued. This year's recipient was selected unanimously by a national review committee. My heart wasn't racing. Why would it? This had nothing to do with me. I simply listened like everyone else. Then she added, the recipient will also receive a community impact grant. She paused, in the amount of $750,000. The entire auditorium gasped. Someone behind me whispered, did she say 750,000? Another student muttered, that's impossible. I stared at the stage, certain I'd misheard. A television camera rolled closer. Another moved toward the front row. Then, one of the producers hurried directly to Mr. and Mrs. Collins. She leaned down and whispered something. Both of them looked completely stunned. They slowly stood. I watched in confusion as they were escorted toward the stage. Why them? What was happening? The host opened a large white envelope. She smiled warmly. Our recipient has spent years organizing free medical clinics, providing health screenings, delivering care to families who otherwise had nowhere to turn. Every sentence sounded strangely familiar. My stomach tightened. No, it couldn't be. Then I heard the next words. Dr. Avery Park, would you please join us on stage? For a moment, I couldn't move. The auditorium exploded into applause, and I stood there, completely speechless. For a few seconds, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. The applause continued. People around me smiled and pointed toward the stage. One of the faculty members leaned over and whispered, they're calling you. My legs finally started moving. Every step felt unreal. When I reached the podium, Dr. Collins was waiting. He smiled the same calm smile he'd worn all morning. I was wondering how long it would take before you believed this was real. I stared at him. You knew? He chuckled. For months. The audience settled into silence. The host turned toward me. Dr. Park, congratulations. Then she faced the crowd. Before presenting this year's Community Impact Award, we'd like to recognize the people who came to celebrate today's recipient. She gestured toward Mr. and Mrs. Collins. The cameras immediately focused on them. I smiled through tears. Everyone assumed they were my parents. Then Mrs. Collins gently stepped closer to the microphone. I'm afraid we should clarify something. The room became perfectly still. We aren't Avery's mother and father. A ripple of confusion spread through the audience. She smiled warmly. We're Dr. Nathan Collins' parents. We met Avery only this morning. Several people gasped. Mr. Collins placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Our son told us she'd be sitting alone today. No young doctor should celebrate a milestone like this without someone cheering for her. So, we simply borrowed the seats. The audience erupted into applause, louder than before. I covered my mouth as tears finally escaped. Mrs. Collins wrapped one arm around me. You deserve to hear someone say they were proud of you. The television cameras captured everything, every tear, every smile, every hug. Within minutes, clips from the ceremony were already appearing online. People watching the live stream kept asking the same question. If those aren't her parents, where are they? Hundreds of miles away. My parents were finishing lunch at an expensive ski resort. Evan laughed as he showed Dad a video from the morning ski run. Mom's phone buzzed once, then again, then 5 more times. She frowned. Why is everyone texting me? She unlocked the screen. Dozens of unread messages. One from my aunt. Are you watching Avery's ceremony? Another from an old neighbor. Please tell me you didn't miss this. Then another. Turn on Channel 8 right now. Mom looked confused. Dad reached for the remote hanging above the restaurant television. The local news station had interrupted its afternoon programming. On the screen, there I was, standing beside the Collins family, crying as the audience applauded. The headline beneath the broadcast read, Medical graduate honored after attending ceremony without her parents. Neither of them spoke. Not a single word. Back inside the auditorium, the host continued reading. Over the past 4 years, Dr. Avery Park organized more than 60 free medical outreach events, helped establish mobile clinics serving rural communities, and personally recruited hundreds of volunteer medical students. I stared at Dr. Collins. You nominated me. He nodded. I wasn't the only one. Hospitals, faculty, community leaders, they all wrote letters. The committee said the decision was unanimous. I felt completely overwhelmed. Everything I'd done, every weekend clinic, every late-night health fair, every exhausting volunteer shift, someone had noticed. Not because I asked them to, because it mattered. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. The people who truly saw me had never been the ones I'd spent years trying to impress. When the applause finally began to fade, the host handed me a crystal plaque, then a second envelope. Inside was the official grant agreement, $750,000. The number still didn't feel real. My hands trembled as I looked at it. I don't even know what to say, I whispered. The audience laughed softly. The host smiled. Just keep doing what you've already been doing. After the ceremony ended, reporters gathered near the stage. I had expected photos with classmates, maybe a few interviews for the university newsletter. Instead, microphones appeared from every direction. Avery, what inspired your volunteer work? What will you do with the grant? How did it feel walking into the ceremony without your parents? That last question stopped me. For a moment, I simply looked at the reporter. Then I answered honestly. It hurt. But today reminded me that family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes, it's the people who choose to stand beside you. The room fell quiet. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Across the country, the interview spread quickly. Former classmates shared clips online. Doctors congratulated me. Community organizations posted messages of support. Thousands of strangers left comments. One sentence appeared again and again. The Collins family showed up when it mattered. At the ski resort, my parents' vacation was over long before they packed their bags. People recognized them. Some said nothing. Others asked uncomfortable questions. Weren't you supposed to be at your daughter's ceremony? We saw her on television. I thought those other people were her parents. Dad stopped answering. Mom barely touched her lunch. Even Evan looked uncomfortable. I really didn't know they skipped it, he admitted quietly. They told me everything was fine. Neither of my parents corrected him. Because they couldn't, by the time I returned to my apartment that evening. My phone showed 93 missed calls. Most were from Mom. The rest were from Dad. Voicemails, text messages, messages that grew more desperate every hour. Please call us. This isn't what people think. We need to explain. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. Finally, the phone rang again. Mom? This time, I answered. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't mention the award. Instead, the first words out of her mouth were, Avery, people are saying awful things about us. I closed my eyes. They're saying we abandoned you. I took a slow breath. You did. Silence. Long, heavy silence. Then Dad spoke. We never imagined something this big would happen. His words surprised me. Not because they were cruel, because they completely missed the point. I spoke as calmly as I could. This was never about the award. It was about the choice. You chose to be somewhere else. Neither of them answered, because there was nothing left to say. My father finally broke the silence. We made a mistake. For most of my life, those were the words I'd waited to hear, but now that they had finally been spoken, they didn't change anything. I leaned back on the bench outside the hospital courtyard. I spent years hoping that one day I'd matter as much as Evan. Mom immediately interrupted. You've always mattered. I shook my head. No, I've always been expected to understand. When Evan had a competition, you were there. When I received scholarships, you were busy. When I started medical school, you mailed a card. When I became a doctor, you went skiing. Neither of them argued. Because every word was true, Mom's voice cracked. We never meant to hurt you, I answered quietly. Intentions don't erase choices. Another long silence followed. Finally, Dad spoke. What can we do to fix this? For the first time in my life, I knew the answer. You can't fix the past, but you can accept that it happened. And stop asking me to pretend it didn't. We ended the call without yelling, without insults, without dramatic goodbyes. I simply wished them well, and hung up. For the first time, I didn't cry afterward. Instead, I felt strangely peaceful. The next morning, Dr. Collins invited me to breakfast before my residency orientation. When I arrived at the cafe, his parents were already there. Mrs. Collins stood and hugged me. "We're so proud of you." I laughed. "I think you've said that more in one day than my parents have in my entire life." Her smile faded. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Then let me say it again. We're proud of you." Mr. Collins nodded. "And not because of the award, because of the person you became." I felt tears sting my eyes again. Not tears of sadness, the kind that come when someone finally gives you something you've needed for years. Over breakfast, Dr. Collins finally explained how everything had happened. Months earlier, he'd quietly submitted my name for the National Community Impact Award. He hadn't told me because the committee required complete confidentiality. "I wasn't even sure you'd win," he admitted. "There were incredible candidates from all over the country." "So who wrote the recommendation letters?" I asked. He smiled. "Almost everyone. The director of the free clinic, your attending physicians, the homeless outreach program, the mobile vaccination teams, the school district, the veterans clinic. Even patients wrote letters." I stared at him. "Patients?" He nodded. "One little girl wrote that she wanted to become a doctor because of you." I had to look away. Somehow, that meant even more than the grant. Later that afternoon, the university uploaded the full ceremony to its official website. Within hours, millions of people had watched. The moment when Mr. and Mrs. Collins admitted they weren't my parents, comments poured in from every corner of the country. "Family isn't always blood. Those two strangers became her parents for the day." This made me cry. The people who show up are your real family. Even national news outlets picked up the story. But while everyone focused on the award, they missed what mattered most to me. Not the money, not the television cameras, not the headlines. The moment I would never forget was seeing two people who had met me only hours earlier stand up and cheer louder than anyone else. Life became surprisingly quiet after that. The interviews ended. The headlines slowly disappeared. My residency began, bringing 16-hour shifts, endless rounds, and more exhausted mornings than I could count. The work was hard. But every evening when I walked out of the hospital, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. The grant committee transferred the first portion of the funding, and together with several local hospitals, we began expanding the free community clinics that had inspired my nomination in the first place. Within months, what had once been a handful of weekend outreach events became a permanent network serving neighborhoods that had gone years without reliable medical care. Watching patients receive treatment they otherwise couldn't afford reminded me why I'd chosen medicine in the first place. Not for awards, not for recognition, for moments like those. One evening after finishing clinic, I found someone waiting outside the hospital entrance. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me." "I wasn't either," I admitted. He gave a nervous smile. "Can we talk?" We walked to a nearby coffee shop. For several minutes, neither of us said much. Finally, he looked at me. "I owe you an apology." I frowned. "For what?" "For not noticing." He stared into his coffee. "I grew up thinking everything was normal. I never realized how often Mom and Dad chose me. I thought that's just how families worked." I studied his face. There wasn't any defensiveness, only regret. "I saw the ceremony," he continued quietly. "When Mrs. Collins said she'd met you that morning." He stopped. "I've never felt so ashamed." "You don't need to apologize for their decisions," I said. "I know, but I should apologize for benefiting from them." His honesty caught me off guard. He reached into his backpack and placed a small photo album on the table. "I found these while helping Mom clean the house." I opened it. Page after page, pictures of Evan, birthdays, competitions, vacations, school awards. Then, tucked near the back almost as an afterthought, 3 photos of me. One kindergarten picture, one middle school science fair, one high school graduation. That was it. 20 years of memories, reduced to 3 photographs. Evan looked down. I never realized. Neither had I. Not completely. Seeing it laid out like that somehow hurt more than all the excuses I'd heard over the years. A week later, my parents asked if we could meet one last time. Not to explain, not to defend themselves, just to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met in a quiet park near the hospital. Mom looked older than I remembered. Dad seemed unusually nervous. Neither of them knew how to begin. Finally, Mom spoke. We've spent weeks asking ourselves how we became the kind of parents who missed the most important day of our daughter's life. I listened without interrupting. She continued, "We kept telling ourselves we'd make it up to you later. And one day, there were no more laters." Dad's eyes filled with tears. "We can't ask you to forgive us, but we're deeply sorry." For the first time, I believed they meant it. The apology was real. It was also years too late. I looked at both of them before answering quietly, "I forgive you." Relief washed across their faces. Then I added, "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. I've spent my whole life waiting to be chosen. I'm not waiting anymore." They both nodded. Not because they agreed, because they finally understood that some bridges can be repaired, but they never become exactly what they were before. A year passed faster than I expected. The free clinic had expanded into 3 permanent locations. Medical students volunteered every weekend. Retired physicians donated their time. Local businesses helped cover supplies. What had once been a dream had become something real. Sometimes, as I walked through the waiting room filled with families receiving care, I thought back to the moment my name had been called on that stage. None of this would have existed without the people who believed in me. One Saturday afternoon, while finishing patient notes, I noticed familiar faces in the lobby. Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Mrs. Collins held a tray of homemade cookies. "I thought your volunteers might need a little encouragement." I laughed. "They're going to love you." Mr. Collins looked around the clinic with quiet pride. "You built all of this." I smiled. "No, a lot of people built this. You were some of the first." Mrs. Collins wrapped me in a hug. "We're just happy we happened to be sitting in the right seats that day." I shook my head. "No, you chose those seats. That's what made the difference." A few weeks later, I received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten. The return address belonged to my parents. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope before opening it. Inside was a single page. No excuses, no attempts to justify what they'd done. Only honesty. My mother wrote that they had started attending family counseling. She admitted they had spent years believing that because I was independent, I needed less attention. She called it the biggest mistake of their lives. My father added a short note beneath hers. "We can't change what we did. We only hope you'll someday remember us for more than our worst decision." I folded the letter carefully, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because, for the first time, they had accepted responsibility without asking me to comfort them. Several months later, the hospital held its annual residency recognition ceremony. As I walked into the auditorium, I smiled. The front row was already full. Dr. Collins sat beside his parents. Sophia was there. Several colleagues waved excitedly. Even former patients had come. One little girl ran over and handed me a drawing. It showed a doctor wearing a white coat. Above it, she'd written in crooked handwriting, "Thank you for helping my mom." I felt my throat tighten. There wasn't a trophy in the world that could mean more than that. As the ceremony began, I looked across the audience. Near the back of the room, I noticed 2 familiar faces, my parents. They hadn't reserved front row seats. They hadn't tried to approach me before the ceremony. They simply sat quietly among everyone else. When our eyes met, my mother smiled gently. She didn't wave. She didn't try to make the moment about herself. She simply smiled. And somehow, that was enough. Not because everything had returned to the way it was. It never could. But because for the first time in many years, they understood that being present wasn't about being seen. It was about showing up. 3 years later, I stood once again behind the stage curtain, waiting for my name to be called. This time it wasn't for a white coat. It was for the National Humanitarian Physician Award, recognizing doctors whose work had transformed access to healthcare in underserved communities. The same community clinics that had started with one volunteer team now served thousands of patients every year. Hundreds of medical students had trained there. Several former volunteers had become physicians themselves. One of them smiled at me from across the room. "You inspired all of us," she said. I smiled back. I just showed up. When the announcer called my name, I walked onto the stage with a confidence I hadn't possessed years earlier. The applause filled the auditorium. I instinctively looked toward the front row. Dr. Collins stood first, then Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Sophia, my residency classmates, former patients. Children I'd treated years ago were now teenagers, cheering louder than anyone. Every seat was filled. Every face belonged to someone who had chosen to be there. Near the back of the auditorium, I noticed 2 familiar figures, my parents. They stood and applauded quietly, not trying to get my attention, Not asking for recognition, simply applauding. When our eyes met, Dad placed a hand over his heart. Mom smiled through tears. I smiled back. There was no anger left, only acceptance. Some relationships never return to what they once were, but they can still find a different kind of peace. After the ceremony, reporters gathered once again. One asked the same question people had been asking for years. What do you think was the turning point in your life? I thought about the award, the grant, the television cameras. Then I shook my head. It wasn't the award. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even becoming a doctor. The reporter waited. The turning point happened the day too. Strangers refused to let me celebrate alone. I looked toward the Collins family. They reminded me that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Mrs. Collins slipped her arm through mine. You know, she said with a smile, we've been arguing about something. Oh? She laughed. My husband insists we only borrowed those front row seats. Mr. Collins grinned. I still think we did. Mrs. Collins looked at me. I disagree. She squeezed my hand. I think they became ours the moment we sat down. I couldn't help laughing. Then I hugged both of them. They were always yours. Driving home that evening, I thought about the young woman who had once stared at 2 empty chairs, wondering why she had never been enough. I wished I could tell her something. One day, you will stop chasing people who don't choose you. One day, you'll realize your worth was never determined by who clapped the loudest. And one day, you'll discover that the people who truly love you won't need to be convinced to show up, because they'll already be there. Sometimes the greatest family you'll ever have isn't the one you're born into. It's the one that chooses you again and again.